I want this to be an interactive class that we look at this morning because I understand that the things we've been discussing during this series are things that are a little different, not typical perhaps of a gospel meeting. And so I would like to get a sense of what you guys are thinking about these things as we study them together and be able to share in some of this in that way. I will say that this discussion that we're going to have this morning is the most cerebral, it's the most complicated one, and I thought it would be better to reserve that for a class discussion so that I could understand if there's something that somebody's not getting, if I'm not saying something in a helpful kind of way that's concise. And so that's what we're going to be looking at this morning, is this need for morality. Now, I want to just do a little bit of review of what we've been looking at. The purposes of these lessons, number one, is to gain a greater understanding of our culture. And that as we understand how people in our culture are thinking, that we might be able to also challenge our own faith. I think about in Titus chapter 1. Do you remember the kind of people that Paul said lived on the island of Crete? Evil beasts, liars, lazy gluttons, people like that. And then Paul is concerned that that culture is influencing the Christians on the island of Crete. Can anybody think of anything that our culture is accepting that is not also a threat to God's people? How many times is it where the world comes up with some kind of idea and then Christians can take those ideas and then baptize it in a couple of religious kind of terms, and then voila, we got some new false doctrine that's come into the world, that's crept into our hearts. And so when we can understand how our culture's thinking about secularism, how to try to find meaning, how to try to find morality, the other things that we're going to be talking about today, we as Christians can be influenced by that sort of thing. So I hope that these lessons are challenging us as well to ask ourselves, am I really trying to find my meaning in God? Is my basis for morality really in what God would say? And then also, I want these classes to be providing a tool for conversations with people, that you might know people that are secular-minded, people who are skeptical. And hopefully some of the things that we talk about in these classes, in these lessons, are helpful to you to be able to engage people in perhaps a new way. But just as a reminder, as a review, can anybody tell us what are some of the causes of skepticism? Yeah. The causes of skepticism that we've been looking at are ones that are emotionally driven. Because how is it oftentimes that a skeptical person would like to present himself or herself? Yeah, we're the smart ones, we're the ones that have logical, rational thinking, that sort of thing. And if you peel back and try to discern what's really going on in somebody's heart, the reasons for skepticism are oftentimes emotion-driven. So what are some of those specific emotionally driven reasons for skepticism? Yeah, so let me put them all up there. So you got a desire to sin. If I want to justify some kind of sinful action, and I'm emotionally drawn to committing that sin, if I get rid of the idea of God and I don't have to submit to Him, and I come up with these really sophisticated arguments, then I can feel legitimate in my unbelief. Or maybe I've had a bad religious experience. I've known a lot of people that grew up in for some reason they didn't appreciate what they had growing up. Maybe their parents were hypocritical, something like that. God wasn't their main passion. And so they grow up with a lackluster, kind of lukewarm family atmosphere, and then they fall away. I'm not saying that every kid that grows up in a Christian family ends up falling away because of that reason, but that is sometimes the reason. Also, cultural background beliefs. And another way of saying that is peer pressure, social pressure. We talked before about how if you lived in the 1500s, you're not going to walk around saying that you don't believe in God because there'd be too much social pressure against it. And in our culture, there's a lot more social pressure against believing in God. And so all of these causes of skepticism are more emotion-driven than they are rational thinking. And so does anybody have any comments or questions or maybe anything they would want to add to that? Yeah.
I think you also see, too, when society's looking at religion, and they're seeing some of the
Right, yeah, you say that you guys have this unchanging Bible, but then you're always rewriting everything and rethinking everything. Why would I want to join something that is obviously contradicting itself at this point? Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'm just saying we might want to be careful, though, when we talk to people, not to come across as if we're dismissing their concerns.
Absolutely.
Oh, you just got these emotional issues, there's no real rational, because all of this could be said for us as well. We're not totally reasoning creatures. How we arrive at our religious convictions is often emotionally driven as well.
Yeah, and my argument is that I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. What I want a skeptic to do is to be able to acknowledge that emotions have played a part in their convictions, and I'm willing to admit it for sure has for me, because we're designed to be emotional beings. And so there's not anything wrong with having emotions dictate what we believe. It's whether or not our rationality is checking it correctly. But yeah, very good point. Anything else you guys? Yeah.
This really, I think, fits under bad religious experience, but sometimes people have decided to put God to a test. If you won't do what they want,
Yes.
then you're not going to believe it. I have a friend who says he's an atheist now, and the reason was he asked God to save his grandfather's life, and his grandfather died.
Right.
And so that told him there wasn't a God.
Yes. Yeah, I know. I've known people that they wanted to have a baby and they ended up having a miscarriage, and they were praying to God, and then God let them down because they thought God promised them that the baby was going to be okay, that sort of thing. So trying to use God in some of these ways, and then when God doesn't come through in what you thought he was going to do, even though he never explicitly promised it, you can think that God's let you down in some way, and so that could be a reaction, yeah.
Would you put rebellion under cultural background beliefs? So, young adults who just decide they want to do everything that their parents said not to, and their parents were Christians?
Perhaps. I wonder if that would be more desire to sin. Yeah, but you can see how all these things end up having some kind of interaction with one another. Yeah, good. And I'll say that whenever I'm studying with skeptics, if somebody says, "Hey, I'm not sure that I have good reasons to trust the Bible," legitimate question. There's really good answers to that sort of thing. But I do like to say, before we get to those questions, is there some bad religious experience in your life? Is there something the Bible teaches that you don't like? Do you feel peer pressure from other people? Because that might be where we need to start, but certainly we will get to talking about why the Bible's trustworthy. There are some people that I think are just very, very rationally driven that are skeptics that may not fit into any of these three things. But I would say the majority of the people I've studied with for sure fit into one of those things. So, all right, anything else you guys want to say about any of that by way of introduction? Is this making sense, what we're doing in these classes, these lessons? All right, so here's the question that's framing everything that we're looking at this weekend. Given the causes of skepticism, what should we consider in reasoning with modern skeptics today? So if for many people the root cause of their skepticism is emotion-driven, what should we remember when talking to them? Because we talk about meeting people where they're at. So if somebody is emotionally driven in their unbelief, and then I come with objective facts and data, am I meeting them where they're at? No. And so what we need to do then, when we're reasoning with people today, is try to discern, is there some emotionally driven thing? And if there's an emotionally driven reason why they're skeptical, what emotionally driven reasons does God give us to come back to Him? So this is where we're looking at the emotional appeals to follow God, to counter the emotional appeals that they have to not follow God. Does that make sense? So you're meeting them where they're at in that way. Okay. So one of the needs that we have is a need for morality. Now, before we get too deep into this, everybody believes in some kind of moral obligation. Nobody would say that, racism is okay for you, but I'm against it. Or murder is okay for you, but I'm against it. We would say, no, I'm against those things, and you all should be against those things. This is not like your favorite flavor of ice cream. I like vanilla, you might like something else or whatever, and we can all get along and all that sort of thing. There's a certain sense of moral obligation that we all feel everybody should abide by certain moral principles. And so which worldview best offers a reason for universal moral principles? That's the question that we're looking at this morning. And so let's go ahead and start looking at some different quotes on how a secular person might ground morality. Okay, one other thing before I read that. Can skeptical atheists do morally good things for other people? I'm not talking about their motives, but can they do morally good things for people? Yes. I've seen them help people and care about certain things to be for other people. So the question is, which worldview best gives them the resources to care about helping other people and to be concerned with universal moral principles? And so some skeptics and atheists would say, well, it's just common sense. It's just common sense. We all know what we should be doing for other people, so I don't know why we need to think too much about what gives us the reason to do these things. But Julian Baggini is an atheist, and this is what he says here. Anyone who thinks it's easy to ground ethics or to give a reason to be concerned with ethics either hasn't done much moral philosophy or wasn't concentrating when they did. Although morality is arguably just as murky for the religious, at least there is some bedrock belief that gives a reason to believe that morality is real and will prevail. In an atheist universe, morality can be rejected without external sanction at any point and without a clear, compelling reason to believe in its reality. That's exactly what will sometimes happen. All right, so Julian Baggini here is saying that you might think that it's easy to determine what's right and wrong and why those things are right and wrong, and anybody who just makes a comment like that, like, oh, it's just common sense, just hasn't thought deeply about how these things work. What is his own critique of the secular approach to morality? Yeah, and he accepts that that's the case because there is no external sanction. There is no God telling us what to do, what not to do. And so the more people that believe that there is no God that's telling us what to do, people are going to break free and do whatever they want to do at times. And so he's saying this is a complicated issue. So the question then becomes, how have skeptics said, well, this is why we're concerned with morality, or this is where morality has come from? And so the first argument would be that morality has come about from evolution. And maybe you can see hints of this in the created order of things, where you'll see some apes helping other apes, and maybe you see altruism in certain kinds of animals where dolphins help other dolphins. I don't know. People can come up with all kinds of examples of this sort of thing. And look at what this atheist, Michael Ruse, has said. Morality then is not something handed down to Moses on Mount Sinai. It is something forged in the struggle for existence and reproduction, something fashioned by natural selection. It is as much a natural human adaptation as our ears or noses or teeth. All right, so here's what a lot of skeptics are saying about this. That, evolution has created morality. There's no God that's told us what to do, what not to do. But through the forces of evolution, we've become more moral kinds of people. And so, what are the weaknesses of that approach? And I'm going to go through a couple of these. Does anybody have any comments or questions just so far, though? Or maybe anybody want to bring out anything that they see as weaknesses to this before we start looking at some quotes? Yeah. Yeah.
We spend a lot of effort and money and technology to become less moral. Like just think of just war or fighting. We spend a lot of effort on killing, learning how to kill, or getting better at killing.
Especially in the 1900s. Like, how many Marxist, communist-like kind of leaders had a lot of people killed in their nations? If evolution was creating us to be more moral, then those things should have been eradicated. Very good point. I saw over here Osteen and then you.
So this is a great demonstration of first world perspective. In our first world societies, we tend to see this kind of thing where we think we're morally superior, and therefore society has evolved. When you go look at the slums of Calcutta, or
Right.
the slave trade in Asia and Africa, that still exists.
And in the Middle East. There's a lot of African slaves in the Middle East right now.
It's a very closed
Right. Clearly, this is a Western guy that doesn't see a lot of bad things happening. Yeah, and I'll get to you in just a second.
Well, with evolution, it's always changing.
Yes.
The bar is always changing.
Yes.
Morality is then.
Right. So there's still no objective standard, right? So if evolution is always changing, then how do we know is it okay to kill this group of people? Is it not okay? Evolution is, even if morality you think has come from evolution, where is the laws and the codes that we're all supposed to abide by? You still don't get that with evolution. Yeah.
I was going to say, did we actually define morality? And I can't think of any way to define it that doesn't use the word should.
Right.
How we should be treating other people, and should implies that there is some authority
Right.
on other people.
And here they're trying to say the authority has come within us from evolution. So yeah, you can already see there's a lot of internal contradictions. So, all right, here's an atheist I'm going to quote. His name is Thomas Nagel. He is an atheist. He used to be a professor at NYU, and he wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos, where he's critiquing other atheists who try to sum up everything with evolution, that evolution's the answer to everything. And so this is a complicated quote, but track with me. It's not a long one. But he says, if evolutionary biology is a physical theory, we'll talk about that in just a second, as it is generally taken to be, then it cannot account for the appearance of consciousness and of other phenomena that are not physically reducible. So here Thomas Nagel is saying that evolutionary biology is a physical theory. What do you think he means by physical theory? Yeah, there's no metaphysics to it. It's all, everything that is in your brain, everything that you decide to do, it's all synapses in your brain. There's nothing other than what you can observe in a microscope. It's all physical. And so Thomas Nagel here is punching back at fellow atheists and saying, guys, you're using evolution to explain so many things that the system of evolution, if true, can't explain. There are certain things that are not physically reducible, like moral evaluations. Where did that come from? Is there some part in your brain that says, oh, this is good and that's bad, and we cracked that part open, and if we took that out, then you'd be a mass murderer, something like that? No. Making moral judgments is something that you cannot physically reduce to anything. And so how can a physical system create non-physical things like value judgments, like your conscience? Your ability to reason and think through things in a complicated kind of way. How could a physical process create an immaterial thing like that? So do you see the nature of, any comments or questions on the nature of his argument there?
The response to this is generally, well, we just haven't figured that part out.
Yes, yeah, that neuroscience is advancing a lot and all that sort of thing. But if you hold their feet to the fire and say, like, they haven't figured it out yet, right? Yeah, well, we will. Oh, okay, so you have faith in science that they will do that. You don't know yet. Exactly, yeah. All right, so there's that one. I'm going to skip this quote from Steve Stuart Williams. Basically, the point of this is that if evolution created morality, and this is another atheist critiquing fellow atheists. Well, whatever, let's just read this. I'm already saying too much about it. If morality were a direct product of evolution, why would people constantly argue about what's right and wrong? Why would we experience inner conflict between what we think is morally right and what we really want to do? You might expect that as an evolutionary psychologist. I'll have some snappy comebacks for each of these questions, but I don't. Traditional moral systems tell us we should not act to satisfy our own selfish needs, but instead should act altruistically. That is, we should act to satisfy the selfish needs of other people. This hardly sounds like a recipe for evolutionary success. So he's basically saying here, if evolution has created moral standards, how come we're all disagreeing about it? It doesn't seem like evolution has brought us to this place where we're all seeing these things in the same kind of way. All right, so I'm going to go quick through that one. All right, here's another one that I want to bring up. Morality can't come from evolution because evolution is the strong eating the weak. So how can the strong eating the weak suddenly create altruistic morality, where we're really concerned about other people? And so I want to show you a quote from a book that Charles Darwin wrote. What's the name of the book again? I think The Descent of Man. Yeah. The Descent of Man is basically his book on how to date people and who you should date. Look at this quote that he says here. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races. Okay, what do you think he means by civilized races? White people. Of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Who do you think the savage races are, according to Darwin? Yeah, and specifically Australians and black people. And if you read his book, those are the two people that he brings up. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. All right, so there's several things to unpack here. He's saying that right now you've got the civilized races of man, the white people, and then you've got baboons. And so there's a stark difference between the two, but there's certain races of beings that have encroached closer to the white man. And those beings that have encroached closer to the white man are Australians, Negroes, black people, people from Africa, that sort of thing. What's he saying is going to happen here? Yeah, the in-betweens are going to be exterminated, and he's not necessarily advocating that white people go and do that, but he's saying, if my theories are true, and he believes his theories, that this is going to be eventually what happens, because it is the strong eating the weak, it is the strong surviving and the weak dying. Do you have a comment on this?
It's the same thing I mentioned earlier. It's a first world point of view. Even in the 1800s, what the English had just been through was the domination of a culture, an entire, continent of people that existed here, and evolutionarily, they are more advanced in terms of physical traits like melanation of the skin, right? We don't do great if we're out in the sun for extended periods of time, and it's a very first world even at that time.
Well, and what he's saying is that evolutionary biology, this theory will not create altruism. Instead, it will create eradication of people. So how can the guy that is most well known for giving us this theory of evolution, even though he wasn't the first to write about it, but he's the one that we remember the most, how can this guy says what this will create is not altruism, but instead what it's going to create is the eradication of certain groups of people? Any thoughts or comments on this one? Yeah.
Altering the definition of what morality is.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. So this is a really important point. So in this, what becomes the moral thing to do is to kill off the weak. That is what becomes the morally good thing to do. Which Tom Holland, not the guy that acts as Spider-Man, Tom Holland is the next quote. He is an atheist from Great Britain. He wrote a very, very good book called Dominion. And the book is about Christianity's positive contributions to every century. He's an atheist, but he still did a lot of good research and wrote a really interesting book on this topic. It's a very long book. But look at what Tom Holland said in this. Hitler's policies, although rooted in a sense of race as something primordially ancient, were rooted as well in the clinical formulations of evolutionary theory. The measures that would restore purity to the German people were prescribed equally by ancient chronicles and by Darwinist textbooks. To eliminate those who stood in the way of fulfilling such a program was not a crime, but a responsibility. And so apes massacre all fringe elements as alien to their community. Hitler did not hesitate to draw the logical conclusion, what is valid for monkeys must be all the more valid for humans. So if what Charles Darwin said was, yeah, there's these fringe groups, there's people from Australia and there's black people, these are the fringe groups of the most advanced people, that monkeys destroyed the fringe groups of people. And so what Tom Holland is saying here is that what was Hitler motivated by? What was some underpinning worldview that he held to that justified what he was doing? Right. And if you look at some of the Nazi propaganda and the videos that they put out, they have pictures of the kinds of people that they were killing, and they were talking about how they're not advanced evolutionary beings as we are, and so we have a duty. And I should have put this in here, but you can find some of their propaganda that says that our duty has become to wipe off these fringe groups. And so we're spending a lot of time on this idea that morality comes about from evolution. Do you see that the theory of evolution does the exact opposite, where it says that the right thing, therefore, to do is to kill off people? Now, let me be quick to say this. I am not suggesting that every skeptic you know that believes in evolution is a proponent of killing people. I think most of the atheists that I've known are not a proponent of killing a bunch of people. But what the point is that if you think your system has created morality, it's done nothing but the opposite historically. That's the point that I'm making towards them. I saw a couple hands. Yeah.
And it takes away our responsibility for it. Because we're not responsible. These are natural desires
Yes.
put into us through the process of natural selection.
Yes.
And as a result, Hitler didn't have any choice but to do what he did because he had the power to do it, and nature drives him to fulfill that as what our natural destiny is.
Yes. Yep, good. It's like Stephen Hawking would say that nobody has free will. Like, it's all just synapses and everything's predetermined, or it's already determined. You don't really have the choice to do anything. And so, even though he wrote a book and somehow all the synapses typed out that book with all those words in the right order to make an argument about how you don't have free will. And so, all right, I thought I saw some other hands on this one. Do you guys see the point, though, that you might say that evolution's created morality? Historically, it hasn't, and the system by itself just can't do it. Yeah. Right. Right, exactly. Yep. What time are we at, by the way? And we end at 45? Okay. All right. Let's see. We can go ahead and let's skip each person decides morality for him or herself. That's on the sheet. So let's talk about how another argument is that morality comes from social consensus. In other words, morality comes about not from evolution, okay, but it comes from whatever our society feels like is the right thing. Okay. Greg Kokel, he critiques this and he says this: the first serious problem is that it violates our deepest moral intuitions, the foundational assumptions of civilization. Some things seem wrong regardless of what society says, including plundering innocent Jews, pressing them into forced labor, and exterminating them. If there is no law above society, then society cannot be judged. So, I don't know if you've got skeptic friends or something. They'll say, yeah, well, society determines what's right and wrong. Okay, interesting. So what about what Mao Zedong did? And what about Pol Pot? And what about some of the things that Stalin did? So, are you saying that it would be wrong for us who live in a different society to say that there was something wrong with what that society did because they determined that for themselves? What do you think they would say to that?
Those were just individuals.
Okay, those individuals, but they made up the majority of the nation that did these things.
Pol Pot.
Oh, sure, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying.
Stalin just made up his own mind.
Well, yeah, and like in the Nuremberg trials or the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 60 to 62 when he was taken from South America and everything. So what they would say in the Nuremberg trials is we were just following orders. And so they just kept trying to say that to defend themselves. But society was largely going along with it. A skeptic would say, okay, well, this isn't a fair critique because societies can determine the morality that they want to do until it starts hurting other people. Okay, so there is some kind of law above whatever society determines then. So let's go through some examples of what it might mean to harm somebody. Would coveting your neighbor's stuff, leading you to take it, be an example of harming them? Oh, yeah. So stealing would be wrong, yeah. What about murdering somebody? Would that be wrong? Yeah, that would be an example of harming somebody else, and that's something that we shouldn't be doing. You can go through some of the 10 Commandments and go, okay, it sounds like your intuitions are really in tune with the 10 Commandments. But where did these ideas come from? I thought society's got to determine for themselves what's right or wrong. Any other comments or thoughts on this one? Yeah.
There's a movement to restore polygamy, right? What makes polygamy immoral versus monogamy? And you have the same argument, just not as Hitler. You don't have to rely on Hitler or Pol Pot so much. You don't have to rely on the dictator, because in parts of the world, polygamy is perfectly fine.
Right.
So what makes it morally wrong in the U.S.? Why is it wrong for our society, but it's okay for them?
Right. Well, it's like, I remember when I was in middle school and when I wasn't a Christian, and people were saying, well, if we say that same-sex marriage is okay, suddenly it's going to be pedophilia, and suddenly it's going to be all these other things. And I remember hearing people say that kind of thing, going, man, you're being kind of extreme. And all of those people were right. Like, as soon as you open the door to certain things and you can redefine marriage or whatever, now it's just a free-for-all. And so what moral grounding do you have for not defining it however you want to define it? And now there are people in California marrying their dogs. And so, all right, another quote from Greg Kokel about this. Moral reformers typically judge society from the inside. They challenge their culture's standard of behavior and then campaign for change. If morality is defined as the present society's standard, though, then challenging that standard would be an act of immorality by definition. Social reformers would not be moral after all, but rather the moral outcasts precisely because they oppose the status quo. So he's saying here that if you want to be a moral reformer, you want to be a cultural critic, that those are the most immoral people in a society because they're going against what the majority believe. But yet we remember a lot of moral reformers as being people that stood up against a lot of oppression and things like that. So everything gets turned upside down when the consensus... By the way, I've started working on a sermon a couple days ago just on the majority in Scripture. How often is it in the Bible that the majority of people are wrong? Genesis chapter 6, the flood. Noah and 8 people. What was the population of the earth back then? I don't know. More than 8 people. And then you've got Sodom and Gomorrah. How many people escaped alive from Sodom and Gomorrah? 3 people. And then you got in the wilderness generation. Most of those people God was not pleased with. Who were the 2 God was pleased with? Joshua and Caleb. So you've got probably over 2 million people there, and God's only pleased with 2 of those people. And then when Jesus is crucified on the cross, who are the people that are trying to stay back the crowds from calling for his crucifixion? They're not there. You got the women that are at the foot of the cross, most faithful towards the end, and John there as well. And so throughout the Bible, the majority are just always wrong. So why would we say that the morality is going to come about from social consensus? All right, anything else you guys want to say about that one? Exactly. Yes. And nobody's going to say that. So nobody really thinks morality comes from social consensus. Nobody really believes that. All right, just briefly then, let's start looking at the biblical approach. Oh, that should say biblical approach there. I'm so sorry about that. All right, so the biblical approach to grounding morality. There's a lot of things we could say about this, but I want to say the most concise thing that there is to say about it that I know about. But start out with this question. Many skeptics will point out that Christians are often hypocritical. Therefore, to suggest Christianity offers better resources to be moral seems laughable. How would you answer that objection? So if we're saying to a skeptic, hey, Christianity gives us the best reasons to be moral, then they say, well, look at how many hypocrites you have. It's, yeah, right, like you've got the best resources to be moral. What would we say about that? Yeah, so we're not saying that Christians are always the most moral people. We're saying that Christians have the best resources to be concerned with morality. Yeah.
And also, we're not to follow the people. We're following God.
Exactly, yes. That goes back to looking past the crowd like we talked about on Friday night. Good. Anything else on this one? Yeah. Right. Yeah, why would you blame God for the decisions people have made? So, yeah.
Well, this is one reason why we have to be self-critical and humble.
Yes.
As individuals and also as a group, that, we talk more and more about we're the guys who have it figured out. We've interpreted Scripture correctly and all of this. It leads to a self-righteousness that draws us away from the truth of the gospel, which is grace, that we're saved by grace. And if we don't realize that we're not saved by grace, then this objection would carry more weight, But if we realize that we're imperfect practitioners of the faith that Jesus perfected, then we can we can answer this objection more clearly, because it's not up to our perfect
Right.
understanding or our perfect practice of Christianity. That's not what saves us.
Right. So when I was in California, there was, they weren't Christians, but they were this family in this neighborhood that my wife and I and the kids would go on a walk through, and one of the Christians lived in that neighborhood. And they said, oh yeah, whenever you walk by that house, those people are some of the richest people in all of this city. But they drive really old cars, and you'd never guess that they were really wealthy. Did they have the resources to buy whatever they wanted? Yeah. Did they make use of those resources? No, they didn't. We as Christians, we've got the resources to be concerned with morality, but we don't always use them. And like you said, we've got to understand that we are not always what we need to be. One of the biggest things people say about Christians is that we're hypocritical. And so we're not saying we are the most moral people. We are saying we've got the best resources for it. But, and I'll also say this, nobody lives totally consistently with their worldview. Nobody lives totally consistently within their worldview. You might be a skeptic that's concerned with moral justice. That's not consistent with your worldview, but it's in an opposite good kind of direction. But we as Christians, we might not really love one another like we need to. And does that mean how many? 5 minutes, okay. All right, anyways, all right, so you see that. Okay, so here's the first. So many of the things we're talking about in these lessons go back to being made in God's image. In Genesis 1:27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. From what we talked about last night, what does it mean to be made in God's image? Yeah, we're supposed to reflect him. And so, here's the clicketizer. You see the clicketizer thing? Let's say that I take this clicketizer and I start pounding nails with it and it shatters, so I call this company Logi or Logi or something. What? Logitech? Whatever that is, yeah. So I call this company and I say, hey, Logitech people, the clicketizer broke and you guys make terrible clicketizers. I know it's a clicker. I'm just being funny. But it's not really that funny. And so, and he said, well, what were you doing with the clicker? I said, well, I was pounding nails with it and it shattered. He said, that's not the purpose of it. If you don't even know what the purpose of this thing is, how can you assess whether it's good or not? If the secular worldview says that we don't even have an objective meaning or purpose, and we don't have any of that kind of thing going for us, how can you even assess who a good person is and a bad person is? You don't even know why we exist. So your worldview doesn't give you any reason or any knowledge to know what a good person would be or a bad person would be. And so how does this verse provide a clear purpose for mankind? We're supposed to be imagers of God. Morality comes not just from what God says, but it emanates from His character. Anything He says is coming from His character. So is something right because God says it? Well, yeah, but everything He says is consistent with His character. So everything He reveals to us is something about, it's revealing something to us about His nature that we're supposed to imitate. Now, there's certain things that He has that we're not supposed to imitate, like vengeance and wrath, like in Romans chapter 12. But there are certain things that He does have, like love and care and patience and all this wisdom, that we are supposed to grow in and learn and imitate. And so our sense of morality comes not from a set of rules, but from a person that we're seeking to know and imitate. And that same person sent His Son to die for us and modeled for us what it looks like to live. Jesus came and He fleshed God out, literally, so that we could see what it looks like to live. And mankind killed Him, but by grace He saves us so that we can be remade back into the one who created us. And so what other worldview has a clear purpose for why you're here, that says something about your morality, but also has that same God coming into this world and dying for us and modeling for us what it means to live and offering forgiveness so that those burdens can be lifted and we can have the freedom and the grace that's been bestowed upon us to motivate us into a moral kind of life. No other worldview is going to offer those kinds of things. Any thoughts or comments on any of that? Do you see how much more clear this is than all the navigating that the secular person... Well, maybe it's evolution, maybe it's social consensus. And you look at where those things ultimately go, and none of those really work. And so this is just clear, concise. Anything else you'd say maybe from the Scriptures on how we would ground morality? Any questions about any of this? Yeah.
Well, you skipped over the deciding for yourself part, and it seems to me that if they say, well, I decide for myself what is moral, and I think that this person's actions are immoral, then you're setting yourself up as God.
Yeah, and whatever could be said for that individual that's deciding for himself or herself is the same kind of arguments for how a society could determine for itself what's right or wrong, and it's just ballooning up the arguments or shrinking it down to the individual. And so the society could say, well, we're God and we're deciding, or the individual could say that for himself. Yeah.
You mentioned Tom Holland's book, and one of the things that's really interesting about that is how he points out all the, a lot of the, particularly, let's say, the social justice movements of our era that are secular in large part. They're often led by kind of atheistic, secular leaders, but they have at their core a moral argument that is based on Scripture. It's based on the equality of
Yes.
mankind. It's something like a transgender movement or something. Its moral power comes from the fact that the assumption that we're all created equal.
Right.
I don't believe that.
Right. Which worldview gave us that we're all created in God? We're all created equally before God. What worldview created the concern for those who are downcast and oppressed? If you lived before Jesus came, nobody cared about that kind of thing. So Christianity has revolutionized the way that the world thinks, but what's happening in our society is people are cutting off the root system from which that fruit came, and that's what Tom Holland says at the end of his book. So, very good.
I will praise you with all of my